A silent handshake just redrew Central Africa's power map overnight quietly. While headlines tracked speeches and coups, a quiet deal in NDJ Amina shifted alliances faster than wars, without a shot fired rejoinder. Why should you care what Ibrahim Traoré triggered today exactly? The next moves change everything from here. You are about to hear something most briefings never state openly. This is not casual information. Miss this and the situation looks like routine diplomacy. And it seems like another regional headline. Stop watching, and you risk believing the simplified version circulating in mainstream summaries. Because without the deeper mechanism, the shift appears random rather than deliberate. Those who only hear surface reports think this is coincidence. Those who stay understand it is positioning. The entire geopolitical board starts to look different. What looked like hesitation was actually calculation. What seemed like silence was coordination. 30 years. For roughly 3 decades, Chad functioned as the strategic anchor of the Sahel security system. Surveillance platforms and rapid deployment forces used to monitor insurgencies across multiple borders. That geographic position made it the hinge between Western Sahel instability and Eastern conflict zones near Sudan and the Central African Republic. The turning point began after the death of Idris Deby. His successor inherited the same alliances but not the same margin of control. Watching nearby governments fall, leaders removed, and military regimes rise, he faced a new equation: survival no longer depended only on foreign backing, but on domestic perception. Inside his own officer corps, younger commanders were observing another figure closely. This is where the first layer of the hidden mechanism appears. The common narrative claims the Sahel alliance states are isolated, surrounded, and weakening. Yet Ibrahim Traoré and his partners understood that isolation is only real if neighbors enforce it. Neutralize the strongest neighbor, and the circle breaks. That realization reframed strategy. They focused on making confrontation unnecessary. A brief field example clarifies the shift. At one border post, soldiers who once treated each other strictly as potential threats reportedly began sharing water. Then information about armed groups, then informal coordination. No treaties announced it, no cameras captured it. But that kind of ground-level trust changes military realities faster than signed documents. So the issue was never whether Chad would publicly switch sides. The real question was subtler: would it remain actively aligned with old partners, or quietly drift? That distinction is what transforms a regional story into a structural one. Among regional observers, one figure has become the reference point for interpreting these signals. Not because he speaks the most, but because his moves tend to precede visible shifts. That figure is Ibrahim Traoré, and in this phase he functions less like a headline politician, and more like a field strategist treading terrain others overlook. One analyst, who has followed Sahelian security dynamics for years, described the pattern this way: the decisive actions are rarely the loud ones. According to that assessment, the most consequential change was not a treaty, not a speech, and not a deployment. It was restraint. When neighboring states expected Chad to lead a regional intervention against alliance governments, it did nothing. That non-move forced planners across several capitals to reassess assumptions overnight. A short incident illustrates the early impact. During a period when sanctions enforcement was expected to tighten along borders, delegations instead began traveling quietly between capitals. No press releases, no televised welcomes, yet logistics channels stayed open. For trade monitors, that contradiction signaled that official policy and operational reality were no longer identical. A second observation confirmed it was not isolated. Intelligence watchers noticed that when controversial decisions were announced by Sahel alliance governments, Ibrahim Amina did not join public condemnation statements. Silence replaced alignment. From that moment, analysts stopped asking whether the balance was shifting. They started asking how far it would go. Everything after that point moved to another level. It began abruptly. Expectations flipped. First came the trigger. Western planners anticipated a coordinated response led from Ibrahim Amina. None arrived, no mobilization. Just stillness. That stillness spread uncertainty faster than any troop column. Then escalation followed in quick pulses, delegations moved. Borders stayed open, statements softened, observers noticed. Assumptions cracked. Each development alone looked minor. Together they formed a pattern. Pressure mounted quietly. Ibrahim Traore did not need dramatic gestures. Instead, he relied on sequencing. One signal reassured, another reduced risk. A third offered incentive. The sequence mattered more than any single move. By the time outside powers recognized the pattern, it was already underway. Momentum accelerated. Regional officers watched. Populations compared, governments hesitated. The psychological balance shifted. A country once seen as a firewall now looked like a bridge. Not officially, not publicly. Aftershock came next. Allies began reviewing contingency plans. Military planners examined alternate routes. Intelligence agencies reassessed surveillance coverage. Yet these are the adjustments that reveal real concern. The most visible consequence appeared in strategic language itself. Where briefings once described a containment line, they began ascribing a transition zone. That wording change signaled a deeper recognition containment might no longer hold. For Ibrahim Traore, this phase did not mark victory. It marked entry into a more complex game. Because once a balance starts shifting, it rarely stops at the first border. And that is where the timeline stops being a sequence of events and becomes a transformation in motion. Numbers change how speculation becomes evidence. Maps confirm what statements avoid. The first is structural. For years, landlocked Sahel Alliance states depended almost entirely on western coastal ports for trade access. That meant any hostile border decision could constrict their economies overnight. A cooperative eastern corridor through a neutral or friendly Chad would create an alternate route toward Sudan and eventually Red Sea access. That single geographic possibility expands strategic breathing space across thousands of kilometers. It means isolation is no longer guaranteed. The second signal measures tempo. Security coordination once flowed through large multinational frameworks. Today, reports point to bilateral patrol discussions instead. It means decisions can be made faster, with fewer veto points, and without external oversight. Speed in security logistics often determines who controls initiative on the ground. The third signal is human. In regions where foreign-backed operations have run for nearly a decade, public frustration has accumulated. Communities that saw little improvement despite prolonged deployments are increasingly open to alternatives. That sentiment does not appear in official communiques, but it shows in recruitment patterns, local support networks, and the tone of public discourse. When populations shift psychologically, political alignments tend to follow. Taken together, these three metrics redefine the situation. Geographic options widened, operational speed increased, public tolerance thresholds shifted. None of those changes alone redraw a power map. Combined, they alter strategic gravity. This is why analysts watching Ibrahim Traore focus less on speeches and more on corridors, timing, and sentiment indicators, because those variables determine outcomes long before formal announcements do. What emerges is not a headline event but a measurable transition already underway. Some observers strongly disagree with this interpretation, and their arguments deserve careful attention. They point out that appearances of alignment can be misleading, especially in regions where leaders often unbalance multiple partners at once. What looks like a strategic shift might simply be cautious hedging. Governments sometimes signal openness to new relationships, not because they intend to change sides, but because they won't leverage in negotiations with existing allies. That argument carries weight. Chad, for example, has not expelled foreign forces, has not formally joined any new bloc, and has not publicly renounced prior partnerships. From a strictly legal standpoint, its alliances remain intact. In diplomatic analysis, formal commitments still matter. Yet the counterpoint lies in operational behavior. Strategic alignment is rarely announced before it becomes visible. When joint patrol concepts emerge outside traditional frameworks, when expected condemnations never arrive, and when cross-border contacts increase despite political pressure, those patterns indicate at least partial recalibration. Not a declaration, not a pivot, but a drift. A second skeptical view argues that even if regional cooperation grows, it may not last. Internal divisions, economic constraints, and leadership transitions could slow or reverse momentum. That is historically plausible. Many regional coalitions begin with energy and fade under pressure. However, this objection overlooks a key difference. The current shift is not driven only by governments. It is reinforced by officer networks, shared security concerns, and public sentiment shaped by years of conflict fatigue. Those forces tend to persist beyond individual administrations. When both perspectives are placed side by side, the picture sharpens. The question is no longer whether change exists. The real question is how deep it runs. Everything pivots here. The moment analysts began tracking closely was not a speech or a deployment. It was the silence that followed a bold move. When Ibrahim Traore made decisions that normally trigger regional condemnation, none came from NDJ Amina, no rebuke. Just quiet. That absence shifted interpretations overnight. That silence was the midpoint signal, because in geopolitics, neutrality from a former enforcer can matter more than open support. It suggested that the old enforcement architecture might no longer function automatically. The implications spread quickly. If a state long considered the region's military anchor stops acting as a guaranteed counterweight, then surrounding countries must reconsider their own alignments. Security planning changes. Diplomatic language softens. Contingency scenarios multiply. The system becomes fluid instead of fixed. For Ibrahim Traore, this kind of shift is strategically powerful precisely because it is indirect. He does not need a formal alliance announcement. He only needs uncertainty among his rivals and flexibility among his neighbors. Silence becomes a signal. From this point forward, the earlier developments take on new meaning. What once looked like isolated gestures now appears connected. What seemed temporary now looks structural. And what appeared local now reveals regional consequences. The realization is subtle but decisive. The story is no longer about one country adjusting policy. It is about an entire strategic environment entering a different phase. And once a system enters that phase, outcomes rarely follow old rules. The consequences stop being abstract and started appearing in real systems people depend on every day. What changed in quiet strategy rooms began to ripple outward into institutions, markets, and daily life. At the state level, decision pressure intensified. Governments across the regions suddenly faced harder calculations about security cooperation, border policy, and diplomatic tone. A leadership that once relied on predictable regional alignments now had to plan for uncertainty. When assumptions about a neighboring military stance become unclear, defense planning becomes more complex and more urgent. That uncertainty alone can reshape national priorities. For businesses, the shift translated into risk reassessment. Trade routes that once looked vulnerable began to look viable again, while previously stable corridors required new contingency planning. Investors tracking transport logistics, infrastructure proposals, or resource exports started watching border relationships more closely than official speeches. Even a small change in cross-border cooperation can affect shipping costs, insurance rates, and delivery timelines. Perception of stability is often as powerful as stability itself. For civilians, the effect felt quieter but closer. Communities living near borders are usually the first to notice changes in patrol behavior, checkpoint routines, or troop posture. When those patterns soften or tighten, residents sense it immediately. In regions that have endured years of conflict, any shift in military coordination alters daily expectations of safety, mobility, and trade. Stability is not an abstract term there. It is whether roads stay open tomorrow. At the regional level, the implications widened further. Neighboring states began recalculating alliances not because they were forced to, but because strategic gravity appeared to be shifting. Once one node in a security network changes posture, others adjust to avoid being left exposed. This is how regional realignments spread not through declarations, but through adaptation. All of this traces back to the same underlying dynamic. Ibrahim Traore did not need a dramatic announcement to produce consequences. He only needed conditions where surrounding actors reconsidered their assumptions. And when assumptions change across multiple capitals at once, the entire board starts moving. The most probable path from here is neither side unruption or dramatical alliance reversal. The likeliest scenario is gradual drift. Cooperation increases quietly, official positions remain cautious, and relationships evolve without formal declarations. Communication channels deepen. Governments publicly maintain balance while operational ties slowly strengthen. It is a slow burn shift, steady enough to avoid shock, but persistent enough to reshape influence over time. There is, however, a more optimistic possibility. Regional coordination stabilizes security conditions and reduces external dependency pressures. If cross-border collaboration improves infrastructure, intelligence sharing, and trade logistics, states could gain leverage without confrontation. Under those circumstances, Ibrahim Traoré's strategy would be remembered less as disruption and more as a catalyst that encouraged regional self-reliance. But it would become more plausible. The worst-case outcome runs in the opposite direction. Balancing multiple powers is inherently risky. If any actor miscalculates or pushes too aggressively, fragile alignments could fracture. Internal divisions, rival influences, or sudden leadership changes might turn cautious cooperation into confrontation. In that environment, uncertainty would spread faster than coordination, and the same flexibility that created opportunity could produce instability. The important point is not predicting which scenario will happen. It is recognizing that all three remain possible at the same time. Strategic environments rarely move in straight lines, especially when several powers are adjusting simultaneously. The wisest approach is careful observation. Because in moments like this, outcomes are shaped less by declarations and more by the small signals that appear before them. Now that the broader landscape is clear, the most important question becomes personal. What does all of this actually mean for someone watching from afar, trying to understand where events are heading and why they matter? For those who actively follow geopolitical developments, this moment offers an advantage. Understanding shifts early provides context that headlines alone rarely supply. Observers in this group can track indicators such as border coordination patterns, diplomatic language changes, and infrastructure announcements. Those signals often reveal direction long before official confirmation appears. Awareness in this case is not abstract knowledge. It is strategic foresight. For those affected indirectly, the implications are quieter but still real. Commodity flows, migration patterns, and security conditions in one region can influence prices, markets, and policy decisions far beyond it. People who never set foot near the Sahel may still feel the ripple effects through trade networks, energy costs, or international agreements. Preparing mentally for that interconnected reality helps reduce surprise when shifts occur. Then there are those who assume events like this have nothing to do with them. Global systems are deeply linked. When regional balances change, consequences often travel along routes that are invisible at first. Waiting until effects become obvious usually means reacting late rather than understanding early. No matter which group someone belongs to, the same principle applies. Understanding the forces shaping the world is not about predicting everything. And in a period when strategic maps are subtly being redrawn, clarity becomes a form of readiness. Solutions cannot remain slogans. Situations like this demand actions tied to responsibility, timing, and measurable results. So what would a realistic path forward actually look like if regional actors want stability instead of drift? First, leadership level. Governments directly involved would need structured dialogue mechanisms that operate continuously, not only during crises. Maintain security coordination channels and transparent border protocols. The timeline must be immediate and ongoing. Success would be measured by visible indicators such as consistent patrol communication, reduced cross-border incidents, and stable trade flow data. Without measurable continuity, agreements remain symbolic. Second, institutional and economic systems. Regional organizations, transport authorities, and infrastructure planners must translate diplomatic openings into operational links. That means road corridors, customs harmonization, and shared monitoring systems. Not years, because logistics momentum determines whether cooperation becomes reality. The benchmark is practical shorter transit times, predictable customs clearance, and steady freight volume. If those metrics improve, cooperation is functioning. Third, public and community level. Citizens, local leaders, and civil networks play a stabilizing role, often overlooked in strategic analysis. Their task is not grand diplomacy but consistent local engagement. Communities that maintain communication across borders reduce the chance of rumor-driven tensions. This can begin immediately and be measured through observable outcomes such as sustained market activity, cross-border trade continuity, and absence of localized conflict spikes. Stability that exists only on paper rarely lasts. Stability felt in daily life tends to endure. A for 3 enforcing layer could involve coordinated information transparency between states and media institutions. When communication is clear, speculation decreases. The metric here is simple: fewer contradictory narratives and more verified updates reaching the public in real time. For figures like Ibrahim Traore, the long-term test is not whether momentum can be created but whether it can be managed. Yet only disciplined execution turns opportunity into lasting structure. Because ultimately, plans do not change realities. Think back for a moment to that early scene, when the first signs appeared not in headlines, but in small movements at borders and in quiet diplomatic corridors. The significance of that moment only becomes clear now, after tracing the chain of signals that followed. What once seemed like routine regional maneuvering reveals itself as the opening step of a much larger transition. Viewers who stayed through the full arc have essentially walked the same path analysts take when decoding geopolitical change. Compared competing interpretations, and finally saw how individual moves connect into structural shifts. That journey mirrors the way real strategic understanding forms gradually, then subtly. At the center of that unfolding process stands Ibrahim Traore, not simply as a political figure, but as a symbol of a wider current moving through parts of the continent. His role in this evolving equation reflects something deeper than a single national story. It reflects a generation testing how power can be renegotiated. What makes this moment resonate is not drama, it is agency. Decisions once assumed to belong only to distant powers are increasingly being shaped closer to home. That change alone alters how the future can unfold. This was never just a regional update. It is a reminder that history often turns quietly before anyone realizes it has already begun. The board is shifting. Every viewer reaches a different conclusion after a story like this. Some see risk. Many see a turning point still unfolding. And that diversity of perspective is precisely what makes discussions like this meaningful, because understanding complex events is rarely about a single interpretation. If this analysis gave you a clear lens on what is happening and why it matters, consider passing it along to someone who values seeing beyond headlines, not to persuade them, but to invite them into the same deeper conversation. The stronger collective understanding becomes. And perhaps the most important part is dialogue. Different viewpoints sharpen insight, especially when they are shared thoughtfully. So a question remains worth asking as this situation continues to evolve. Which signal do you think will reveal first that the balance has truly shifted? Wherever you stand, you are not alone in watching closely.